So let's talk about neural homeostasis. Now, there's actually a few syllabus objectives and they're jam-packed, so it may well be that this is split over a couple of videos. There's two methods of communication in which mammals and other animals use to communicate responses to effectors. They are the nervous system and the endocrine system, which involves hormones. Now, nervous-mediated responses are very rapid. They are temporary, they're very short-lasting, and they're very localized. Whereas responses that involve hormones, they take longer to act because they need to wash through the blood or the lymphatic system. They hang around longer, they're a longer duration, and they're more generalized, so they can affect larger parts of the body. So as we learn more about different types of homeostasis, we'll differentiate these. At the moment, we're talking about the nervous-mediated responses, or neuronal homeostasis. And the functional unit is the neuron, otherwise called the nerve cell. I've made a point here to talk about the direction of nerve conduction. So it gets received at the dendrites, sent down the axon to the axon terminals, where it will then either go to another neuron, to the dendrites of another neuron, or to an effector, muscle, or a gland. So you need to be able to basically draw or identify and label a basic neuron, and also talk about the role that each of the structures has. So firstly, let's start at this end where we've got the dendrites. And now they're branches that are they receive the input from a previous neuron. So you can imagine, so when we talk later about the synapse, you'll see that this is the postsynaptic neuron. Okay, so it receives its stimulus from another neuron, and so it's going to have receptors at the ends of the dendrite that receive the neurotransmitter, and then it's going to send an action potential or an electrical signal down through the axon. So the next part is the cell body, or the soma. So those terms are interchangeable, and so this is basically like the part of the cell that has all those cellular functions, like the mitochondria and the endoplasmic reticulum, and the nucleus, of course, to control the cell. Now, we have a very long branch called the axon. Now, it's along the axon that the action potential or the electrical signal is sent along. Now, this can be over a meter long in the leg of a human, or they can be really short, like in the brain. But so this is the axon is the big long section of the neuron that's a little bit like a cable. It is wrapped in this stuff called myelin. Not all neurons are myelinated, but many of them are. And so myelin is a type of sort of fat, and it insulates the axon, and its function is to actually make the action potential or the signal move faster. Okay, and so it does that by actually making the electrical signal jump between them, but we don't need to know that in any detail. Only to know that the gap in between them is called the node of Ranvier. At the far end, we've got the axon terminal, and so this is where the presynaptic terminal of the synapse. Now, we're going to talk about the synapse in the last part of this video, but it's the junction between two neurons, and because the nerve conduction goes in this direction, this is the end of the nerve conduction, and it needs to then jump to either another neuron or to an effector, and it does that via a neurotransmitter. So at the axon terminal, this is where the neurotransmitter starts. So more on that when we do the synapse. That second syllabus objective is to differentiate between the types of neurons. So the easiest way to think about it is in terms of the function. A sensory neuron transmits information from the receptors, so like the sensory receptors, to the central nervous system. Motor neurons go the other way, from the central nervous system to our effectors. And there's also interneurons in between that link the sensory motor neurons. So that happens in the spinal cord. You can see this is a cross-section of the spinal cord here. The sensory neuron receives the stimulus from the sensory receptor, and it goes into the spinal cord. And then we have an interneuron that stays within the spinal cord that goes between the sensory and the motor neuron. And then we've got the motor neuron that comes this other way. So if we have a look here, you can see this is the cell body and the dendrites, and this is the axon. And then here we have got our axon terminals. And the other way we can differentiate between the sensory and motor neurons, if we have a look at this picture here, you can see the motor neuron has its cell body within the spinal cord, but the sensory neuron does not. The sensory neuron has its cell body outside of the spinal cord. Okay, you can see here, it's outside of the spinal cord. So it's got dendrites on one side, and then the axon, then the cell body, then the axon again, and then the axon terminals. So that's something that another way you can differentiate between the sensory and the motor neurons. Saying again, sensory neuron has the cell body outside of the spinal cord. And here we can see it differentiated again. The interneuron is just the one in the spinal cord. The sensory neuron, think about its function, it transmits sensory information to the central nervous system or the control center, but its cell body is not in the spinal cord. And so, in other words, the cell body is somewhere along the length of the sensory neuron, and the motor neuron has the cell body within the spinal cord, and its function is to send electrical impulses to the effectors.